Hello, everyone. I'm Courtney Chambers, your webinar host from the ERDC Environmental Laboratory. I'm glad you all could join us today for this Ecosystem Management and Restoration Research Program webinar. Today we're going to learn about the development of a Minnesota River environmental flow modeling framework. All right, at this time, I would like to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Kyle McKay is a research civil engineer from the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center, and he has been a researcher that has readily shared his work with us over the year. You've heard from him a couple of other times already this year, and he's going to share today about his Minnesota River model. His research focuses broadly on examining ecological effects of water resources infrastructure with applications related to stream and watershed restoration, fish passage improvement, environmental flow management, and sustainability policy. You'll see Kyle here. I have his bio loaded if you would like to click over and read a little bit more about Kyle and some of his publications. This will also be posted on the Gateway with the webinar files later today. Okay, at this time, Kyle, I'm going to give you the presenter right, and we can get started.
Well, thank you all for making time this afternoon. I'm excited to be here and excited to tell you more about this project that I've been really lucky to be a part of. The project is, in the Minnesota River Basin, and I've been working in close collaboration with Chuck Zeiling and Michael Dougherty, and I'll point out that any good ideas are from them and any errors are mine and mine alone. So this work's been supported by the St. Paul District and their partnership with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and then partially by EMRP as well. So what we're going to talk about, though, is how water management affects different ecological outcomes. And this sort of classic water management problem is usually framed in the context of being environmental flows or in-stream flows. And people approach these kind of questions from all sorts of different angles. So for instance, it could be about how a reservoir is operated and the downstream effects of reservoir operations. Or it could be about, for instance, a state regulating how much water may be withdrawn from a river or how much needs to be left in the river. And then two other perspectives you see are more broad-scale changes, so focused on things like how watershed land use change or climate change could affect water flows and associated ecological outcomes. But in general, all of these different questions center on the same basic idea of the flow regime that Leroy Poff and others suggested 20 years ago, that how does the flow regime of a river affect the ecological integrity of that system? Or, said slightly differently, how do changes in the flow regime affect ecological outcomes that we care about, that one might be managing for? Those outcomes could be anything from water quality to a specific fisheries outcome. So today we're going to talk about a case study, and this case study is in the Minnesota River Basin and is supporting ongoing Corps of Engineers and state studies in that basin. And it's part of a much, much larger effort than what I'm going to show you. I'm just going to show you a narrow little slice that's focused on fishery outcomes and environmental flow issues. So for those that aren't familiar, the Minnesota River Basin is an enormous place. It's almost 44,000 square kilometers, and it's an area that used to be sort of a poorly drained area with lots and lots of wetlands. And as a result of ditching and other land use changes, for instance, there's now 75% row crop ag in the basin, there have been enormous changes to the ecosystem. So more than 85% of wetlands have been lost, and all of the streams show a large increase in discharge on the whole. But this is an incredibly important basin. It's got unusually high aquatic biodiversity. There's over 88 species of fish currently in the basin, and historical records indicate that could be more than 100 that would have natively been in the basin. So the state has been working hard on this issue, and in fact has gone as far as declaring a state constitutional amendment and associated investments in basin management in Minnesota. And as part of those activities, there have been a lot of modeling and scientific studies done in these basins. So the Corps has been working with the state on building out this hydrologic model that covers the entire basin, or the Minnesota portion of the basin, I should say. And this model is about estimating hydrology at lots of different places in the watershed, and it's constructed in the domain of HSPF, or the Hydrologic Simulation Program Fortran. And some version of this has been in development for more than 20 years. And over time, that calibration gets better, the resolution of the model improves, the domain increases in size, but the same basic model has been growing as sort of an evolving tool for asking questions about how basin management could be affected. So in the version I'm going to tell you about today, I'm only going to look at discharge. But what's incredible is that we can look at it at more than 1,000 locations in the watershed. And these pour points, or these small drainage areas, allow us to estimate discharge in a high-resolution fashion. So for instance, here's one pour point where I've shown 18 years of estimated discharge as the gray lines, and the median over that 18-year period is the heavy black line. And we can do this at each of those 1,000 locations, which provides a strong hydrologic foundation for asking ecological questions. All the while, so while these hydrologic tools have been developed, the state pollution control agency and the state DNR have been conducting extensive biological monitoring in the basin. And they've gone out and sampled fish at over 600 sites, or I should say over 600 visits throughout the basin. And what we've done here is paired the hydrologic data with the fish data. So we gauge transferred the HSPF data to the fish sites. So now we have locally specific hydrology for each of these fishery sampling sites. And we eliminated those sites because of maybe not a perfect match between the HSPF models and the fish sites. So when our data set was finally in place, we had over 450 sampling events at more than 300 locations. And these locations range over, 4 orders of magnitude of watershed size, and an enormous range of discharge as well. So just to give you a feel for the data set we're looking at, you can see the Minnesota River Basin as a whole, and you can see that the modeling nodes on the left and the fish sampling locations on the right. And you can see as well a gap in the upper basin, which is currently a gap in our knowledge, but that doesn't prevent us from working with the data we have. So we started addressing this problem through 3 basic questions. The first is, how does hydrology affect fishery communities? And in that type of question, we're going to talk about developing environmental flow models. And then secondly, how could changes in land use alter hydrology and subsequently affect fish communities? So in that section, we're going to talk about applying those models we developed in the previous section. And then finally, what can we learn from this particular modeling exercise? So we're going to take a step back and talk generally for a moment about what we learned from this model development. So we looked at three competing philosophies for modeling environmental flows. And these have very different assumptions associated with them. They have very different sort of intellectual basis, if you will. So the first, we said, let's think of hydrology as a proxy for ecology. If you get the water right, the fish will follow. That's a pretty common assumption in environmental flows. And what that allows us to do is avoid what are typically pretty messy flow ecology relationships or challenging variables to correlate and understand the mechanisms of. But it's a proxy. It's not what we're ultimately interested in, which are fish outcomes. Second, let's take a different approach, a more mechanistic approach, a deductive modeling approach. And in this style of model, we developed some hypotheses and some principles on how we think the world works. And we can construct models around these first principles. But these models might not have the highest predictive power, which leads to our third modeling approach. And in that approach, we're focused purely on the idea of prediction. And in this approach, we're going to use an inductive model or a machine learning model that's about providing the data to the model and letting the data drive the model structure rather than the mechanisms. So thinking about that first model, the hydrologic proxy model. So here what we did is looked at 7 different streamflow statistics. And these were identified in a national study by Stacy Archfield and others, where they looked at hundreds of flow metrics, and they said these 7 parsimoniously work together to summarize flow regimes. And they're exactly what you would expect. Mean discharge, how skewed or variable that discharge frequency regime is, what's the seasonal amplitude and phase, and a couple of other statistical measures as well, which I won't go into. So this hydrologic proxy with these 7 variables is going to be our first model. Our second model, again, focuses on a deductive linear model and on this idea of can we identify the mechanisms that really matter or the variables that really matter. And to do this, we look to a very old method that's pretty common in engineering called dimensional analysis. And in this basic approach, what we're interested in is creating dimensionless variables that scale across process. And we're interested in creating regressions that are dimensionally homogeneous. So for instance, we looked through the literature and we identified 6 key variables that needed to be a part of our models. The first is our response variable. So in this study, we're interested in fish community richness, or the number of species at a given site. Secondly, we looked at drainage area and said, well, we know that as watersheds get larger, they tend to accommodate more species. So let's think about drainage area. Third, channel width. We use channel width and channel depth as surrogates for both habitat quantity, but also dynamics associated with things like light and floodplain accessibility. Fifth, we looked at mean discharge. So I mentioned some existing studies in the basin, and those have indicated through a number of different mechanisms that mean discharge as a whole has gone up as a result of agricultural development. So we knew that was an important variable. And then finally, we used the gravitational constant as a scaling parameter for reducing the dimensions of this particular problem. So we did this through, again, this nearly 100-year-old method called the Buckingham Pi theory. And that allowed us to combine these variables through the method of repeating variables into 4 dimensionless ratios. And if you dig in, they kind of make sense. So the first one on the left is the dimensionless quantity species richness. So that's our variable of interest. And then there's 3 independent metrics which we're working with. The first is a relative measure of discharge. So how much discharge is there for a given drainage area size, for a given basin size? The second term is a common metric from geomorphology, the width to depth ratio of a particular site. And the third term is a common hydrodynamic variable, or the Froude number, which is a ratio of the relative forces within a channel. And because these are dimensionless, now we can structure them as part of a linear equation, and we can use our data to fit these models. So when we did this, the first three metrics, or excuse me, the first two independent variables, the relative discharge and width to depth, came out as significant, but the Froude term didn't, so we discarded that. And what that left us with was a model with reasonably high predictive power. So it's an okay model from an ecological standpoint of an R-squared of almost 0.4. And this is based on a purely deductive approach, again. So what happens if we take a very different model development approach? So this is where we looked into this growing body of methods called machine learning models or inductive models. And just as an aside, this is how search engines work. So when you go to Google or Firefox or Bing or whatever your search engine du jour is, you type in something and it's interested in returning the most commonly searched terms, or excuse me, clicked on links when someone searched for that. So let's say I Googled something like ESA. That might return hits for the Endangered Species Act, the Ecological Society of America, or the European Space Agency. Those are not connected mechanistically, but they are connected in the sense that that's what people were looking for. So this type of model is, again, focused on predicting what we're interested in. And these are really flexible models. This family of models, they can deal with different types of data, missing values, they're robust to outliers. So they have some real advantages from an ecological standpoint. And in this particular case, we used one form of machine learning called a boosted regression tree, and we executed this in the R statistical software. And what we did was we looked at 135 potential covariates. So we just threw data at the model and said, what predicts species richness most accurately? And we can predict it with quite a bit of resolution. So looking at all of those variables, we can predict species richness with an R-squared of more than 0.8, which is pretty great from an ecological prediction standpoint. But some of those variables are more important than others and appear in more of those models. So what we did was we took the top variables, which you see in the upper right portion of this figure, and we said, what if we only used those top 6 variables? And we refit the model. And even with only those top 6 variables, we get a very high R-squared and very high predictive capability. So now we've got our 3 different models, our hydrology model, our deductive linear model, and our inductive machine learning model. Let's see what happens when we apply them to the Minnesota River question. And I should note that all of this is part of an ongoing project, and we're still sorting through the analyses, so please consider all of this subject to change at this point. So for our model application, though, the district developed 6 different scenarios for how land use could be managed in the basin. The first is, well, let's assume the basin stays roughly how it is now, or the existing condition. What's out there right now? And this was the scenario we used when calibrating our models, because that's the scenario under which the fish data were collected. Secondly, we said, well, what's the future without project? And this is a minor change from the existing condition, but it includes enforcement of recently passed riparian buffer ordinance. The third scenario said, what if in the future someone wanted to maximize biodiversity and conservation outcomes? And they manipulated land use change accordingly. A fourth scenario said, what if instead of biodiversity outcomes, we wanted to maximize agricultural outcomes to the greatest extent practical? And then finally, what if we implemented lots of different water quality BMPs throughout the basin? And then the last scenario is more a point of comparison than it is an alternative future. So what are pre-settlement conditions in the basin? And this was a historical land use, or at least a mimic of a historical land use in the basin, which, although maybe unrealistic as a potential place the basin might go, it's a very useful point of comparison for direction of change, as we'll see. So what does this look like in an actual watershed? So this is a sample basin in the 7 Mile Creek watershed, and you can see how each of these 6 scenarios play out in terms of changes in the landscape itself. And we see that the biodiversity and pre-settlement scenarios share some of the similar features, although the biodiversity scenario certainly accommodates a lot more row crop agriculture. We see that the water quality scenario shares some features with the biodiversity scenario, although it focuses on how those features are implemented in a very different way. And then we see the increased agricultural scenario really pushes the basin as far as it can in terms of limiting riparian forest extent and really wringing the most we can out of agricultural outcomes. And when we apply these models to these different scenarios, we can see what happens. So here I've shown the change in each of those scenarios relative to the existing condition. So we passed our GIS scenarios through our HSPF models, through our environmental flow models, and that's how we got here. So what I want you to focus on is not every aspect of this very busy chart, but a couple of key things. For instance, the biodiversity scenario is typically in the same direction as the pre-settlement scenario. That, for instance, on this 6th flow metric, FDSS6, we see that the biodiversity scenario and the water quality scenario are moving things towards what they would have been like historically. And an analog to that is the increased ag scenarios typically move things away from the pre-settlement scenario. So we're seeing some consistency emerge across these 7 different flow metrics. Likewise, we can use our ecological models to predict fish richness outcomes at a particular site. So here I've shown a given site, and we can predict a time series of what we think richness was relative to hydrology, and then look at how these land use changes could affect those particular locations. We can also summarize those data just like the hydrologic data as a change relative to the existing condition. And again, we see the same basic direction of change associated with our flow metrics as we do with the deductive linear models, where we see the biodiversity scenario, water quality scenario moving towards the pre-settlement, and we see the increased ag scenario generally moving away from that condition. But we see some key differences showing up when we start digging in to the machine learning outcomes. And we'll circle back to that, but I want to point out that that different models are leading to different outcomes. So here's a summary of how some of this looks. And what you have is, what you're looking at is the scenarios on as the rows, and then for each of the columns, we have different metrics that come out of our environmental flow analysis. The first 7 are those flow metrics, those proxies for ecological change, and the last 2 are ecological models, the first being a deductive model and the second an inductive model. And what you'll notice is that overall, the directionality of change for that biodiversity and water quality scenario is consistently the same as the pre-settlement scenario. And overall, the increased ag scenario goes the opposite direction. But we're seeing some key differences. For instance, between the 2 models of richness in the lower right, you see some differences between the inductive and deductive model. So we're still sorting through the mechanisms of why this is the case, but I just want to point out that not all models lead to exactly the same observations about the basin. So what can we learn from this type of environmental flow exercise? These models allow us to predict a time series of ecological outcomes. So I showed you one example. Here's another in the lower left of predicting species richness through time, not just at one point in time. And we're still figuring out how to use these data because it's producing such a complex prediction in the sense that we can look at mean richness for this site. We can look at the lowest richness in a given year. We can look at the high end of richness. What's the maximum richness we ever expect to see at a particular location? So we're still figuring out how best to use these complex time series outputs. But we do think structuring models in this predictive way of outputting a time series seems to be a useful way of thinking about ecological change at a particular site. Secondly, right now we're focused on state variables or a snapshot view of the world, like species richness, where we're looking at a community property at a given time. But in many cases, folks like Kit Wheeler and Mary Freeman and Seth Wenger have indicated that maybe we want to switch from these state variables like richness to rate variables. Maybe we're interested in, instead of the abundance of organisms, we're interested in the survival or reproduction rates between 2 time periods. So we started with richness, and that makes a lot of sense, but it would be great to explore alternative ecological metrics, whether they're community scale, like IBI scores, or population scale, like survival and reproduction rates, or ecosystem scale, like biomass or production estimates for a particular system. And this incredible data set the state of Minnesota has provided facilitates asking these sorts of interesting, nuanced ecological questions. And then I want to have a brief aside, and I hope you'll tolerate a minor tangent here. But we've also developed these 3 different models to explore the robustness across predictions. And another way of framing this would be that these models have completely different philosophical bases, or they have different epistemologies or ways of thinking about the world. So for instance, thinking of hydrology as a proxy for ecology is a very different philosophical construct than a predictive model of how species richness changes with particular input variables. And just as an example of how this can play out in other disciplines, on the right I've shown the definition of the word significance in different contexts. So for instance, when we're talking to our family at home, we may use the word significance simply to mean importance or meaning. But to an experimental scientist, they may use that word to mean statistical significance or a low probability that observed measurements or values of interest occurred by chance. That's a very different, more rigorous definition than that lay usage from before. Likewise, there may be issues where something is statistically but not biologically significant. So this is the classic example of correlation and causation, where two variables may correlate, but it may be non-causative or spurious. And so something could be statistically significant, but not biologically significant. And then finally, just an example related to the Corps of Engineers, where the Corps uses the word significance in a policy context to define whether something is nationally or regionally significant for its restoration programs. And this example is just to point out that in our modeling problem, we tried to take three different views of how the world works, or three different epistemologies. And we think that it changed how we understand the problem. So our modern statistical tools, like the R programming software, allow for development of lots of models at once. And we don't have to prescribe that managers think about the world through one particular lens. We can look at it through the lens of the hydrologist on the team, the ecologist on the team, the computer scientist on the team, and everyone can develop competing models and learn different things about the system. But what's interesting is similar variables emerged from both the deductive and inductive models. So maybe we do have some pretty strong understanding about what the key driving variables are. And maybe thinking about the world in these competing epistemologies allows us to create a weight of evidence. And that weight of evidence can give confidence to decision makers that we're not getting lost in the weeds of modeling, that we do know something strongly assertive about the direction of change in a particular system. And we can ask questions like, do we make the same recommendation regardless of which model we're using? So although it sounds like a philosophical aside, I think our approach to this problem in developing competing ecological models provided a key foundation for how we think about environmental flows in the Minnesota River. So with that, I would be happy to take any questions, and I want to be sure to acknowledge both my co-authors and collaborators, but also the state of Minnesota for their generous provision of the fish data, and the St. Paul District for their incredible work with developing and using these HSPF model outputs. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Kyle. Okay, at this time, let's have an opportunity for some questions or discussion. I don't want to rush anyone, so I'll allow a few minutes for everyone to gather their thoughts or type in their questions. I'm going to share the link to today's, where today's webinar will be posted.
Well, I'll add one more note, Courtney, and that's that although this presentation focused on the Minnesota River Basin, I would say a lot of states and a lot of watersheds are starting to have similar types and structures of data. So for instance, under the SWIMS framework, the Corps has built out an enormous base of knowledge of hydrology throughout the country. And a lot of those basins do have long-term fisheries monitoring data that could be analyzed in the same context. So although this seems like a basin-specific study, I would say the methods reach more broadly. And if anyone is interested in the deep, dark details of the methods, I would be happy to share the report we're working on, but also the computational code, which anyone is welcome to apply.
That's very good. Thanks, Kyle. I was wondering about the transferability of your work here in the Minnesota River Basin. That's good to know. All right. Are there any questions or comments that you want to get to Kyle before we wrap up today?
Hi, Courtney. It's Candace Piercy from ERDIC.
Hey, Candace. Go right ahead.
Kyle, I had a question sort of on the model philosophy you mentioned. I generally, when I think of machine learning models, I think of them as uncovering connections that are sort of mechanistically there, but we just weren't aware of. However, there are cases where machine learning has found some of these spurious connections or things that are very site-specific. Can you sort of comment on how you might tease those two apart? Are we just, in our conceptual model of how the system works, are we just missing something that's there, or are we picking up on things that are just sort of spuriously connected?
So that's a good question, Candace. I would suggest that that how you apply these models can help avoid those kinds of problems. For instance, the family of models I was using are called boosted regression trees, and in this kind of application, you develop the models by withholding data sets and cross-validating across portions of the data set. So that's one way to make sure that the models aren't spurious. The second would be that they create many regression trees all at once and then predict as an ensemble. And then the third point I'll make is that, lost my third point. Oh, I know what it was. The third point of reducing the number of variables in the model. So for instance, looking back at this slide here, where we first built the models using all of the variables that we put in, but then we used a reduced version of the model with only the top 6 variables, or those variables that appeared in lots of those regression trees. And that, again, helps isolate which variables are more mechanistic and mean the most in terms of prediction.
Thanks, Kyle.
Okay, well, Kyle, thank you very much for sharing your work on the Minnesota River and for just providing an opportunity for us to learn more about what you've done here and the potential for application in other places. If you don't mind, would you go back to your last slide, and we'll have your contact information up for people to follow up if they have a thought after the meeting or a question about how to maybe apply this somewhere else or inquire a little deeper. And then, so with that in mind, Kyle, do you have any closing comments for us?
Not particularly. Just thank you for hosting, Courtney, and thank you all for attending. Please let me know if I can do anything to pass along more information about environmental flows. I'm always happy to have a conversation. So, thank you.
That sounds great. Thank you, Kyle. Participants, thank you all for tuning in today and for learning with us. With that, we're going to conclude our meeting today. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.